They called him broken, useless, half a man. When Elias Crow rolled off that train in his weathered wheelchair, the woman who had sent for him took one look and spoke the word disabled like it was poison on her tongue. She turned her back and rode away, leaving him stranded on a frozen platform with nothing but his tools and his shame in front of the whole town. But what nobody in Red Willow knew that day was that the man they just threw away was about to save every single one of them. He would expose a traitor hiding in plain sight. He would survive a fire set to kill the woman he loved. He would face down 3 armed men in the dead of night using nothing but an old water pump and an engineer's mind. And the woman who rejected him would one day stand before him and say the 5 words she should have said from the beginning. But that is not even the best part. The best part is what he found in a town that did not want him. Stay with me until the very end, because this story will change the way you see strength forever. Welcome to Cowboy Dusk channel, the place where the frontier comes alive. We bring you tales of rugged cowboys, fierce women, untamed land, and the kind of love that was forged in dust and fire. If the Old West lives in your heart, you are home. This story reminds us that a man's worth is not measured by whether he can stand, but by whether he refuses to stay down. And love does not come to those who are perfect. It comes to those who are brave enough to show their scars and honest enough to accept someone else's. If this story moved you, hit that like button and let me know. Drop a comment and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Share this with someone who needs to hear that broken does not mean finished. And if you have not already, subscribe to Cowboy Dusk and turn on that bell so you never miss a story. We ride again soon.
The last bullet Elias Crow owned had lived in his coat pocket for 3 years, not to kill anyone, but to remind him that he had once had the choice and had not taken it. He sat in the passenger car of the westbound Union Pacific, not staring out the window like most travelers did when the territory opened up around them white and endless. He was working. His hands moved with the automatic precision of a man who had repaired this wheelchair 1,000 times, tightening a loose axle bolt with a folding knife and a strip of leather he kept in his vest pocket for exactly this purpose. The chair was his own design, reinforced oak frame, custom brake mechanisms he had forged himself in a Denver machine shop before they let him go. Tool mounts along both sides where he kept a pry bar, a measuring tape, and a small canvas roll of wrenches. The chair was not beautiful, but it was built to last, and that was more than most people said about the man who sat in it. A drummer across the aisle watched him work with the kind of fascination people usually saved for circus performers. Elias ignored him. He had learned 3 years ago that people would stare, and that staring was the least of what they would do. 3 years. That was how long it had been since the mine collapsed in Colorado and took his legs and left him with hands that could still build anything, and a mind that refused to quit. But the memory that lived behind every waking moment was not the collapse itself. It was the moment before. Standing at the entrance to Tunnel 6 with the taste of whiskey still burning on his tongue. 3 glasses with the boys before the night shift. He had known he should not go in. His reflexes were slow and the edges of the world were soft and blurred. But the shift boss was watching, and pride was louder than caution. And so he had walked into that tunnel the way a man walks into his own grave without knowing it. The crack of the support beam. The sound of the earth deciding to swallow him. Darkness. When he woke 3 days later, a doctor was explaining very carefully that modern medicine could work miracles, but some things were beyond repair. And all Elias could smell was whiskey, still on his shirt. 3 days later, he had not touched a drop since. But the guilt sat in his chest like a stone he could not cough up. He believed he had stolen his own legs, that the wheelchair was not a misfortune but a punishment he had earned. This was the thing he had never told anyone. This was the thing that made him accept the cruelty of strangers as something he deserved. The train whistle cut through the February afternoon, sharp and unforgiving. Red Willow Station, Red Willow. The conductor called it out with that practiced enthusiasm that came from saying the same thing 200 times without meaning it once. Elias checked his brake one more time and peered through the frost-glazed window. The town emerged from the white landscape like a dark scar on clean linen. Red Willow was not much to look at. A handful of buildings hunched against the wind, smoke rising from chimneys, the inevitable water tower standing sentinel over it all. But even from the train, Elias could see the signs of a place in trouble. Boarded-up storefronts, a church with a caved-in roof that nobody had bothered to repair. Beyond the last buildings, the snowdrifts held shapes that might have been cattle bones bleached white by the winter that had killed them. This was 1887, the year they called the Great Die-Up. Blizzards had swept across the open range from Montana to Texas, killing millions of head of cattle and breaking the back of the ranching economy that kept towns like Red Willow alive. The frontier was not just hard this year, it was dying. The train lurched and slowed and lurched again. Elias performed the familiar choreography of departure, break off, hands to wheels, off, hands to, forward 6 feet to the wider space near the door. The cold hit him when the door opened. Wyoming cold. The kind that found every gap in your clothing and settled into your bones like it meant to stay. He could smell frozen horse dung and coal smoke, and the metallic bite of air so cold it hurt to breathe. The conductor positioned the railroad ramp, standard issue, warped and splintered but functional. Elias rolled down it with the smooth efficiency of long practice, and his wheels crunched on ice crystals scattered across the platform boards. He spotted her immediately. Adelaide Pritchard stood at the far end of the platform wearing a heavy wool coat with a fur collar turned up against the wind. She was perhaps 42, though the frontier had a way of adding years that had nothing to do with calendars. Her face had the kind of handsomeness that came from strong bones and stronger will, and her eyes held the sharp evaluation of a woman accustomed to appraising livestock. Elias had answered her advertisement in the Denver Post 6 weeks ago. Widow seeks capable husband for ranch partnership, must be skilled, sober, and God-fearing. He had written 3 drafts of his reply. In the first, he had mentioned the wheelchair in the opening line. In the second, he had buried it in the middle. In the final version, he had described his carpentry skills, his literacy, his experience with livestock and irrigation, and mentioned almost casually that he used a wheeled chair for mobility, but found it no hindrance to skilled labor. Her response had been short and businesslike. Arrival acceptable. February 14th. Will meet train. He had allowed himself to hope. That was his first mistake. Adelaide did not speak when his chair cleared the ramp and rolled into full view. She just stood there, and Elias watched her gloved hand tighten around her leather purse until the knuckles went white through the material. 30 seconds of silence. The longest 30 seconds of his life. Longer than the mine collapse. Longer than waking up and learning he would never walk again. Because in that silence he could see the future he had imagined crumbling like the walls of Tunnel 6. When she finally spoke, her voice shook. Not with disgust exactly, something closer to desperation. The bank will never accept you. The words did not make sense to him. Not then. He heard only what he expected to hear. You are not enough. Mrs. Pritchard, he said, keeping his voice level and pleasant because he had practiced this. I apologize if my letter was not clear. I can assure you that my wheelchair does not affect my capability for the work you described. I have references from 3 Denver businesses that can confirm. She cut him off. Capability. The word came out harder than she probably intended. A few heads on the platform turned. She noticed and lowered her voice, but not the edge in it. Mr. Crow, I run a working ranch. 1,500 acres. What is left of 60 head of cattle after this winter. I need a partner who can ride fence lines and work from dawn until dark in all conditions. I understand the requirements. Look at you. She gestured at his chair with one gloved hand, the motion quick and dismissive. You cannot even stand. The words hung in the frozen air between them. Several people on the platform had stopped pretending not to listen. Elias could feel their attention like heat on his skin, though the wind was cold enough to make his eyes water. "I will pay your return ticket to Denver," she said. "It is only fair. That will not be necessary." "Mr. Crow, surely you cannot intend to stay in Red Willow. There is nothing here for someone in your situation." There it was. Your situation. As if being in a wheelchair was something that had happened to him yesterday and not something he had lived with and worked with and built a life around for 3 years. "I will find something," he said. Adelaide reached into her coat and pulled out a small leather purse. "At least let me give you something for the journey. I feel terrible about this misunderstanding." "No." The firmness in his voice made her hand stop. For just a moment, something flickered in her expression. Maybe respect. Maybe just surprise that he had refused charity. Then her face closed again, and she turned and walked toward the far end of the platform where a wagon waited. The driver was a quiet man in a rancher's coat, Carson Briggs. Elias noticed him only because he noticed everything. Carson did not stare at Elias. He barely glanced at him. He was relaxed and uninterested, already turning the horses before Adelaide had fully climbed onto the wagon seat. The man was a background figure, forgettable, the kind of man you did not think about twice. Adelaide drove away without looking back. The train whistle blew. Final call. Elias sat alone on the platform as his easy way out built steam and prepared to depart. He could get back on, could go back to Denver, back to the boarding house where they charged him extra for the ground floor room, back to the machine shops where they would hire him for a few weeks before finding reasons to let him go, or he could stay. He looked down at the 3 wooden steps leading from the platform to street level and began calculating angles in his head. 8 inches per riser, 3 feet wide, not fixed to the platform, just heavy enough that nobody had bothered moving them. His brain did what his brain always did when the world handed him an obstacle. It reached for mathematics instead of self-pity. The station master wandered over, an older man with a badge that glinted dully in the weak sunlight. "You planning to stay or go, son? Train is about to leave." "I am staying." The station master looked at him with an expression that suggested he thought this was a very poor decision. "There is a boarding house 2 streets over. Ruth Sedgwick runs it. She might have a room." He glanced at the wheelchair. "At the steps, but you would need to get down there first." "Those steps removable?" Elias asked. "What? Are they fixed or freestanding?" The station master blinked. "They are just sitting there, I suppose. Railroad put them in when they built the platform." "I can build a ramp," Elias said. "If you have planks in your maintenance shed, I will do it myself. No charge. There's a wheelchair ramp law in most territories now, required at all public stations." He had no idea if this was true in Wyoming, but he said it with enough confidence that the station master hesitated. "Maintenance shed is around back," the man said finally. "You break anything, you pay for it." "Fair enough." The train pulled away. Elias watched it go, watched his easy way out disappear into the white distance. The station master mentioned offhandedly that the spring thaw was expected early this year. "Snow has been too heavy," he said. "When it goes, the creek will jump its banks, same as '84. Flooded half the town back then." He said it the way locals said things they had accepted. Not a warning, just weather. But the information landed in Elias's engineer mind and stayed there like a seed dropped into waiting soil. He wheeled around to the maintenance shed and found lumber and nails and a serviceable hammer and a saw that needed sharpening but would work. By the time he had measured and cut and assembled a functional ramp beside the station steps, the afternoon sun was already starting its early winter descent. His hands were numb, despite his gloves, and his shoulders ached from the work, but the ramp was solid, angled at exactly the grade he needed, reinforced at the stress points, wide enough for his chair with room to spare. He tested it 3 times. It held. While he measured the last board with the span of his hand, he did not see the woman standing across the street. A laundry basket balanced on her hip, dark hair escaping from beneath a faded bonnet. She watched each of his movements with something in her eyes that was not pity or curiosity, but the sharp, specific attention of someone recognizing a thing she had thought was lost forever. Martha Hale had watched 3 men arrive in Red Willow with hope in their eyes. The first 2 left in pine boxes. The third was sitting on the train platform measuring steps like they had personally offended him. She stood in the doorway of her laundry on 4th Street and watched him work through the last gray hour of afternoon light. She had seen the whole sorry business with Adelaide Pritchard at the station. Half the town had. Word of the mail order, husband who got rejected for being disabled, had already traveled from one end of Main Street to the other faster than the telegraph could carry it. People talked. In a town this small, talking was the only entertainment that did not cost money. But Martha was not watching Elias Crow out of sympathy or curiosity. She was calculating. Her water pump had been broken for 2 months. Every morning she hauled water by hand from the well to her wash tubs. 6 trips, 50 pounds per trip. Her back was giving out and her hands were raw and cracked, and the skin across her knuckles had split so many times it did not bother healing anymore. Her mangle iron needed a new gear that nobody in Red Willow could fabricate. Her delivery cart had a cracked axle she had been nursing along with wire and prayer. The last mechanic in town had packed up and left in December, saying there was no money left in a dying town. Martha watched Elias build that ramp, and she did not see a charity case. She saw a solution to her problems. Red Willow was dying. 3 families had left last month. The druggist had closed shop, and the only doctor was talking about relocating to Cheyenne where people could actually pay him. The Great Die-Up had killed the ranches that kept the town alive, and without ranches, there was no freight and no commerce and no reason for Red Willow to exist. The town needed people, needed skills, needed reasons not to give up. The man in the wheelchair was building a better ramp than any carpenter in town could have managed. Martha could see that even from across the street. The angles were precise. The joints fit clean. He worked fast but not sloppy, and when the old blacksmith Tom Birch wandered over and tried to help, Martha saw the stranger politely correct Tom's nail placement, and Tom stepped back with the look of a man who had just realized he was outmatched. That was interesting. Tom Birch did not defer to anyone. Martha went back inside and finished pressing Mrs. Patterson's linens and loaded the delivery cart and hauled it down the street by hand because the cracked axle would not survive the weight of a full load. She delivered the laundry and collected her $1.25 and bought flour and coffee at Nora Sedgwick's dry goods shop instead of Lloyd Hutchinson's general store, because Lloyd had started looking at her in ways she did not care for, and because Nora gave receipts and Lloyd never did. By the time she returned to the laundry, the sun was nearly gone. She locked the front door and walked through the steam-filled workroom to her living quarters in the back. A kitchen, a bedroom she could see through a half-open door, a small eating area that doubled as her ironing station. She locked the back door. 3 locks, top to bottom. It was a ritual she had performed every night for 3 years. First when James was alive, because the locks bought her time when he came home drunk and looking for a fight. Now because the habit was so deep in her bones she could not sleep without hearing those 3 clicks. She opened the bedside drawer. Inside lay the Colt Peacemaker she had bought 6 months after James died, a box of cartridges, and a folded letter. She unfolded the letter even though she knew every word by heart. James's handwriting, sloppy, written from a saloon somewhere between here and Rawlins. The usual drunken apology. Sorry for last night. Did not mean it. You know how I get. We'll make it up to you. But it was the last line that kept her coming back to this letter night after night, like pressing on a bruise to make sure it still hurt. Open the door for me, Martha. It is cold out here. She refolded the letter, put it back in the drawer beside the gun, closed the drawer, did not lock it. The night James died, he had come home late and drunk and mean. He hit her twice, once in the ribs, once across the face hard enough to split her lip. She had run to the bedroom and thrown the bolt and pressed her back against the door while he pounded on it and cursed and called her names that still echoed in her head on quiet nights. Then he went quiet. She heard the front door slam, heard his wagon creak and his horses protest, and then the sound of wheels on frozen ground fading into the storm. She did not open the door. She did not call him back. She did not run after him to say, "Stop. You are too drunk to drive in this weather. You will kill yourself." The next morning, they found his wagon at the bottom of the ravine on the Cheyenne Road. James was underneath it. He had been dead for hours. Martha had never told anyone that she could have stopped him, that she had heard him leave and chosen her own safety over his life. She carried that silence like a stone in her chest, and it had made her hard and careful and determined never to need anyone again, because needing people meant trusting them, and trusting them meant opening doors, and opening doors meant getting hit. The next morning she watched from her doorway as Lloyd Hutchkins stepped out of his general store and looked across the street at the man in the wheelchair, who was adding a final coat of something to the ramp's surface to prevent ice from forming. Lloyd watched for a moment, then glanced to his right. A man on horseback was passing along the street. Nobody Martha recognized, just a ranch hand in a worn coat. But the rider tipped his hat to Lloyd, and Lloyd nodded back with the casual familiarity of men who knew each other. Martha frowned. Since when did Lloyd Hutchkins know ranch hands by name? Lloyd barely knew his own customers by name unless they owed him money. She filed the observation away and walked across the street to the train station. The man in the wheelchair had finished his ramp and was collecting his tools. Up close, he was younger than she expected. Early 30s, maybe. Dark hair, cut short, clean-shaven jaw. Hands that were large and scarred and calloused in the specific patterns of someone who worked with metal and wood for a living. His suit was old, but clean. His hat was new. He had tried to make a good impression on Adelaide Pritchard, and it had not been enough, and Martha felt a twist of something in her chest that might have been recognition. "I have got work for you," she said without preamble. "Pays $2. But I will warn you now. I am not easy to work for. I do not need anyone feeling sorry for me. And if you do sloppy work, I will not pay a cent." Elias looked up at her. For the first time since arriving in Red Willow, someone was speaking to him, as if the wheelchair did not exist. She was not looking at the chair, she was looking at his hands. "When do I start?" he asked. "Yesterday," she said. "You are already late." The last time Elias Crow held a whiskey glass was 3 hours before the earth swallowed him whole. Now, every time he caught the smell of liquor, his hands shook. Not from craving, but from remembering. His first full day in Red Willow started before dawn. He dressed in the tiny ground floor room at Ruth Sedgwick's boarding house. The room was barely larger than a closet, a narrow bed, a small table, one window looking onto the back alley. Ruth had given it to him without comment or apology. $1 a day, she had said. Includes breakfast, no cooking in rooms, no drinking, no women, payment in advance. She charged him exactly what she charged everyone else, and that small fairness meant more to Elias than she would ever know. Breakfast was eggs and bacon, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. 6 other boarders sat around the long table in the dining room, and the conversation stopped when he wheeled in. Not dramatically, just that subtle shift that happened when something unexpected entered a familiar space. Elias found a spot at the end where his chair fit without blocking the aisle, and ate quickly and spoke little. A traveling salesman named Fred kept glancing at him between bites. Finally, the man could not hold it in any longer. "You are the fellow from yesterday at the station." "That is right." "Hell of a thing. What were you thinking coming all this way in your condition?" Daniel Farrow was a lanky kid of maybe 19 who helped around the boarding house. He set down his fork hard enough to ring against the plate. "Maybe he was thinking he is a skilled tradesman looking for honest work, Fred. Same as anybody else." The tension dissolved, but Elias felt a flicker of something unexpected. He caught Daniel's eye across the table and nodded. Daniel nodded back and returned to his eggs. After breakfast, Elias wheeled out into air so cold it made his lungs ache, and made his way down 2nd Street to Tom Birch's smithy. The building radiated heat from half a block away, and the ring of hammer on anvil carried sharp and clean in the frozen morning. Tom was shaping a piece of iron when Elias rolled through the open doorway. He glanced up but did not stop working until the piece was done. Then he plunged it into the water barrel with a hiss of steam. "Was not sure you would show," Tom said. "You offered paying work. Why would I not?" "Fair point." Tom gestured toward the back where a freight wagon sat with one wheel removed. "Brake on the rear axle. Mechanism seizes up when it drops below freezing. Makes the wagon dangerous on any kind of slope. I have been putting oil on it for months. Does not help." Elias wheeled over and examined the setup. The brake was a standard lever system with a friction pad pressing against the wheel hub. He could see the problem immediately. The pivot point was corroded, and someone had been applying oil which only attracted more moisture, which caused more rust. The lever arm was also slightly bent, putting stress on the mechanism at the wrong angle. "You have got a wire brush and kerosene?" he asked. "Both. I am going to need to take the whole assembly apart." For 2 hours, Elias worked while Tom attended to his own business. Shoeing horses, repairing a plow blade. The smithy was a comfortable place to work. The heat from the forge kept the cold at bay, and Tom did not hover or offer unnecessary help. He just let Elias work. The fix was methodical and satisfying. Disassemble. Clean every piece with kerosene and the wire brush. File down the burrs on the pivot pin. Use Tom's anvil to straighten the bent lever arm with precise hammer strikes. Reassemble. And then, instead of oil, Elias applied a thin coat of graphite powder to every moving surface. "Try it now." Tom worked the brake lever. It moved smooth as butter. He worked it again harder, still smooth. He looked at Elias with something that had not been there before. Respect. "How did you know to use graphite instead of oil?" "Oil attracts moisture in cold weather. Moisture causes rust. Graphite does not attract water and does not freeze." Elias wiped his hands on a rag. "Should work fine unless the temperature drops below -20, and if it does break, failure is probably the least of your problems." Tom tested the brake one more time, then reached into his pocket. $2 like I promised. But I have another question. You looking for steady work?" "I could use steady work." Tom laid it out plain. Repair jobs piled up around Red Willow. Wagons, tools, equipment. Things he did not have time for or the right touch for. Pay was not much. Maybe $8 to $10 a week, depending. But it was regular, and Elias could use the shop and keep what he made on side jobs. Only catch is people might not like doing business with a smithy that has you working here. "A cripple," Elias said. "You can say it. I do not use that word, but others will. Just want you to know what you would be walking into." Elias thought about his dwindling money, about Ruth Sedgwick's boarding house and the need to eat and the long winter ahead. He thought about Denver and the jobs he had lost, the opportunities that evaporated the moment people saw his chair. "I will take the work." They shook on it, and something in Elias's chest loosened. Not relief, exactly. More like the feeling of finding solid ground after a long fall. He left the smithy at midday and made it approximately half a block before trouble found him. Lloyd Hutchkins stood in front of his general store, mid-30s, heavy set, wearing a shopkeeper's apron. He had the kind of face that suggested he smiled often, but he was not smiling now. "You, the cripple, Adelaide Pritchard, brought in yesterday." Several people on the street stopped to watch. Elias could feel their attention settling on him like weight. "I am the one she sent for," he said carefully. "Do not know that she brought me anywhere." Lloyd stepped off the boardwalk and into the street. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders. He walked right up to Elias's chair and, without warning, put both hands on the armrest and shoved. Not hard enough to tip the chair, but enough to drive one wheel into the frozen drainage rut along the road. The chair lurched sideways. Elias caught himself on the wheel rims, and his palms burned against the cold iron. "We do not need charity cases in Red Willow," Lloyd said loud enough for the whole street to hear. Elias righted his chair himself. He did not call for help, did not look around for rescue. He reached down and pulled the iron pry bar from its mount on the side of his chair. It was 18 inches of solid steel. He held it loosely across his lap and looked up at Lloyd with eyes that were very calm and very steady. "Push me again and I will put this through your kneecap. Then we will be even." Lloyd's smirk flickered. He glanced at the pry bar, at the crowd watching, at the fact that backing down from a man in a wheelchair would make him look weak no matter how it played out. He chose retreat, dressed up as indifference. Whatever, just stay out of my way. He went back to his store and let the door slam behind him. The crowd dispersed. Nobody had intervened, but several people lingered, and Elias could see in their faces that the encounter had gone differently than they expected. The cripple had not cowered, had not begged, had not wept. He had picked up a weapon and drawn a line. That afternoon, Elias went to Martha Hale's laundry to build the ramp she had hired him for. The building was on 4th Street, narrow and steaming with the perpetual smell of lye soap and wet fabric. The back porch had 3 steps leading up to it, and Elias could see immediately why she needed a ramp. Getting heavy laundry baskets up those steps dozens of times a day would break anyone's back. They worked side by side through the afternoon. Martha washed and wrung and hung clothes on indoor lines, while Elias measured and cut and assembled. Neither spoke much. Occasionally she brought him water. He nodded thanks. The comfort of shared silence said more than conversation could have. While positioning a support beam against the back wall, Elias noticed something. Old damage in the wood, gouges at about fist height. Several of them clustered together. They had been roughly patched with wood putty and painted over, but the repair was poor and the marks were clearly visible if you knew what you were looking at. Elias knew what he was looking at. He had seen marks like these before. In the boarding houses where men came home drunk and put their fists through walls because walls did not hit back the way wives did. He said nothing, but he noticed the height of the marks and the pattern of them and filed the information away in the part of his mind that never stopped working. That evening back at the boarding house, Daniel offered him a glass of whiskey in the kitchen. Standard custom among the boarders. A drink before bed to take the edge off the cold. Elias took the glass, lifted it. The smell hit him like a fist. Sweet and sharp and familiar. 3 years of sobriety balanced against 1 moment of weakness. His hand trembled. The whiskey in the glass shivered with the tremor. He set it down without drinking, pushed it away. Daniel noticed, said nothing, just poured himself a glass and changed the subject to the weather. It was a kindness, and Elias was grateful for it. That night wind carried sounds from beyond the town. 2 sharp cracks from the direction of the Pritchard ranch. Gunshots spaced exactly 3 seconds apart. Elias heard them from his bed and lay still listening for more. None came. By morning, nobody in town mentioned it. But when Adelaide Pritchard came into Lloyd's store, Martha noticed from across the street that Adelaide's wrist was bruised beneath her glove, and that the foreman driving her wagon sat stiffly as though favoring his ribs. Martha watched them and wondered what kind of trouble was brewing out at the Pritchard ranch. She did not yet know the answer. But she trusted her instincts, and her instincts said that whatever was happening between Adelaide and her foreman was only the beginning of something much worse. There were 2 kinds of dangerous men in the West, the kind who drew fast and the kind who kept good books. Lloyd Hutchkins could not hit a barn door at 10 paces, but his pen had ruined more lives than any Colt ever made. 4 weeks had passed since Elias rolled off that train, and Red Willow was slowly getting used to the man in the wheelchair. Not accepting him exactly. More like adjusting to his presence the way a body adjusts to a splinter. He was there. He was not going away. People dealt with it in their own fashion. Tom Birch paid him $10 a week, and the side jobs brought in another 3 to 5, depending. Elias had paid Ruth Sedgwick a week in advance and started saving for tools of his own. He ate Ruth's cooking, which was plain but plentiful. He listened to Daniel's stories about growing up in frontier towns with no family and nowhere particular to be. He ignored Lloyd Hutchkins when their paths crossed on the street, which was often because Red Willow was small, and Lloyd's store sat right in the middle of everything. And he saw Martha Hale. Their friendship had grown in the quiet way that frontier friendships did. Not through grand gestures, but through repeated small encounters. He fixed her delivery cart's cracked axle. She brought him supper one evening when he worked late at the smithy. He repaired a broken hinge on her front door. She mended a tear in his coat and left it folded on his workbench without comment. They ate dinner together twice a week now. Their conversations ran longer each time, covering everything from irrigation engineering to the price of soap to childhood memories of places that no longer existed. Neither crossed the unspoken line between them. Elias, because he believed he did not deserve what he was beginning to feel. Martha, because she believed she destroyed everything she touched. Two people standing on opposite sides of the same wall, each convinced they had built it for the other's protection. Then Lloyd made his move. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Martha was elbow-deep in a wash tub when Daniel burst through the laundry door out of breath. "Martha, Lloyd Hutchkins is down at the sheriff's office. He has got his ledger out and he is telling Morrison you owe him $40 for supplies you bought on credit. Says he has got a witness who will swear they saw you sign the account." Martha went still. Her hands stopped moving in the water. For a long moment, the only sound was the drip of laundry and the hiss of steam from the heating tubs. "That is a lie," she said quietly. "I have never bought anything from Lloyd on credit. I pay cash, always. I know that and you know that. But Lloyd has a man named Harlan backing his story. Drifter. Came through town a few weeks back. Says he was in the store when you signed." Martha dried her hands slowly. She walked to the counter, opened the drawer, took out the Colt peacemaker and checked the cylinder. 6 rounds. She stood there holding the gun and staring at the wall, and Daniel watched her with wide eyes. She put the gun back, closed the drawer. The whole thing took maybe 10 seconds, but Daniel would remember it for the rest of his life. "Go find Elias," she said. "Tell him what is happening." Elias was at the smithy when Daniel brought the news. He set down his file and listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, Elias sat very still for a moment, thinking. Then he asked a question that surprised Daniel. "This witness, Harlan, where did he come from?" "Nobody knows. Just showed up a few weeks ago. Plays cards, drinks, does odd jobs when he can find them." "Where does he play cards?" "The saloon here, mostly. But I have heard he goes down to Rawlins sometimes for the bigger games." Elias filed that information away and wheeled out of the smithy toward the sheriff's office. But the investigation hit a wall almost immediately. Most of Lloyd's customers refused to say a word against him. Lloyd ran the only general store in town. Cross him and your flour might go missing. Your kerosene might be out of stock. Your credit might dry up. In a dying town in the middle of the worst winter in memory, nobody wanted to make enemies with the man who controlled the supplies. Only Ruth Sedgwick and Tom Birch were willing to speak up. Ruth because she feared nothing, and Tom because he had seen enough cowardice in the war to last a lifetime. It was not enough. But Nora Sedgwick found something. Ruth's niece was sharp as a new blade, and she kept meticulous records at her dry goods shop. She went through Martha's account and found that on the exact day Lloyd claimed Martha had signed his credit ledger, Martha had been across town delivering laundry to the Patterson family. Nora had the delivery log, timed and dated in Martha's own handwriting. Mrs. Patterson would confirm. It was an alibi. Not ironclad, but solid enough to cast serious doubt on Lloyd's story and Harlan's testimony. Elias brought this evidence to Sheriff Morrison, who listened and nodded and said he would look into it. But the sheriff was a cautious man who did not like making enemies, and Lloyd Hutchkins had friends and a loud voice, and Morrison was up for re-election in the fall. The ledger accusation hung in the air like smoke. Not resolved, not forgotten. Just suspended while the town waited to see what would happen next. What happened next came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday 3 days later. Elias was working late at Tom's smithy. Tom and Irene had gone home hours ago. The forge was banked low, casting a dull red glow across the shop. Elias was sharpening a set of chisels by lantern light when he heard something in the back of the building. A sound that did not belong. The scrape of metal on wood. A drawer being opened. He killed the lantern instantly. The shop went dark except for the ember glow of the forge. Elias sat motionless in his chair, listening. His heart was hammering, but his hands were steady. Years of working in mines had taught him to function in darkness and to trust his ears over his eyes. Footsteps, careful but audible on the plank floor. The intruder was in Tom's office space at the rear of the shop. More scraping, the sound of papers being shuffled. Elias could not chase anyone, could not run, could not tackle or grapple or do any of the things a man with working legs would do. But he could think. He released his wheelchair brake silently and rolled toward the rear door using the shop layout he had memorized over 4 weeks of daily work. He knew every bench and every anvil and every stack of iron. He moved between them like water around stones. Near the workbench, he found a horseshoe by touch, heavy iron. He hefted it once, then threw it hard against the far wall of the shop. The crash was enormous in the silence, metal on stone. It echoed like a gunshot. The intruder froze, then bolted. Elias heard boots pounding toward the back entrance. Heard the door bang open, caught a glimpse in the faint light from outside. A shape, medium build, moving fast, gone. He wheeled to the back door and looked out into the alley, but there was nothing. Just darkness and cold, and the retreating sound of boot heels on frozen ground. Then he looked down and saw it. A leather glove lying on the floor just inside the door. The intruder had dropped it in his rush to escape. Elias picked it up and brought it to the forge light. Fine leather, expensive stitching, worn smooth at the fingertips from years of gripping reins. This was not a townsman's glove, this was custom riding gear, the kind of thing a working ranch hand would wear. He examined Tom's office. The locked drawer where Tom kept customer accounts had been forced open. Papers disturbed. Someone had been looking for records, receipts, documentation. Why would anyone care about a blacksmith's accounting records unless those records could prove something that somebody needed to stay hidden? Elias locked the glove in his own toolbox. He said nothing to anyone, not yet, but pieces were beginning to connect in his mind. Lloyd's false ledger, the drifter Harlan who played cards in Rawlins, and now someone searching a blacksmith shop for financial records in the middle of the night. Wearing gloves that cost more than most men in Red Willow made in a week. Ruth Sedgwick had said something to him at breakfast that morning. She had been talking about Lloyd and his bullying, and she had paused and looked at Elias with those sharp schoolteacher eyes. Lloyd is a dog, she had said, but dogs have owners. Find the man holding the leash. Elias was beginning to think she was right. Fire on the frontier did not spread. It leaped, roof to roof, wall to wall, like something alive and starving and smarter than you expected. 2 more weeks passed, and the tension in Red Willow wound tighter with every passing day. Lloyd's debt accusation against Martha remained unresolved. Sheriff Morrison made noises about investigating, but did nothing concrete. The drifter Harlan had disappeared from town as suddenly as he had appeared, and Elias kept the expensive glove locked in his toolbox and kept thinking about who in Red Willow could afford custom leather riding gear. But life continued, because it had to. Elias worked at the smithy each morning and took repair jobs each afternoon. He fixed the school teacher's broken bookshelves, repaired an irrigation pump for a rancher named Greer, who paid $3 and did not comment on the chair. He redesigned his own wheelchair brakes using a new graphite compound that worked better in extreme cold. And his relationship with Martha was changing. It happened so slowly that neither of them could have pointed to the exact moment. But there were signs. The way she lingered after delivering Tom's laundry to the smithy. The way he found excuses to stop by the laundry on his way back to the boarding house. The way their dinners together stretched from an hour to 2 hours to the point where Ruth Sedgwick would find him wheeling in after dark with a look on his face that made her smile knowingly. Their first physical contact was an accident. They were pulling a large sheet from the clothesline in Martha's backyard when a gust of wind caught the fabric and snapped it between them. They both grabbed for it at the same time, and their hands met on the cold, wet cloth. Neither pulled away. For 3 heartbeats they stood there, his hand over hers, the wind whipping the sheet around them like a sail. Then Martha stepped back and said something practical about the weather, and the moment passed. But it had happened. and both of them knew it. Elias was also thinking about the flood. Every evening after work, he spread his plans across the small table in his boarding house room and studied the problem. The spring snowmelt was coming. When it arrived, the mountain runoff would overwhelm Red Willow's old irrigation ditches, and the creek would jump its banks exactly as it had in 1884. The town would flood. Homes would be damaged. The water supply would be contaminated. And Adelaide Pritchard's ranch, which sat on the upstream watershed, would lose its entire irrigation infrastructure. Elias could see the solution: a diversion channel system that would redirect the worst of the runoff into a new reservoir upstream of town. It was elegant engineering. It would work. But it required building on Adelaide's land, and Adelaide Pritchard was not speaking to him. This is where Elias made his mistake. He was so excited about the engineering solution that he forgot about the human problem. He caught Adelaide at the general store on a Saturday morning and approached her directly, in public, with people watching. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said, "I have been studying the flood risk to Red Willow, and I have designed a diversion system that could protect both the town and your ranch. It would require access to your upstream property, but I believe—" Adelaide cut him off with a look that could have frozen the creek all over again. "I do not take advice from men I have already turned away, Mr. Crow." The words landed like a slap. Several people in the store heard them. By afternoon, the whole town would know that the cripple had tried to tell Adelaide Pritchard how to manage her land, and she had put him in his place. Martha was furious with him when she heard, not because he was wrong about the flood, because he had been careless about how he delivered the message. "You cannot just be right, Elias," she said. "You have to be right in a way people can hear. You walked up to the most powerful woman in this territory and told her what to do with her land in front of witnesses. 2 months after she rejected you publicly, how did you think that was going to play?" She was right, and it stung because he knew she was right, and because the sting came from caring what she thought more than he had realized. "I was trying to help," he said. "I know, but helping people who do not want your help just looks like arrogance, especially when you are the one they already dismissed." He went back to the boarding house that evening with Martha's words ringing in his ears, and the knowledge that he had set back his own cause by weeks. The town that had been slowly warming to him was now whispering that maybe he did not know his place after all, that maybe the cripple was getting too big for his britches. He deserved it. That was what the voice in his head said, the same voice that had been saying it for 3 years. "You were drunk when the mine collapsed. You stole your own legs. You do not deserve respect or acceptance or love. You deserve exactly what you get." He was still sitting at his table at 2 in the morning, staring at his flood plans, when Daniel's scream tore through the night. "Fire! Fire on 4th Street. The laundry is burning." Elias was out of his room and through the boarding house before his mind had fully caught up with his body. He crashed through the back door into the alley and wheeled toward 4th Street as fast as his arms could drive him. The cold was savage. The wheels hit frozen ruts and ice patches, and twice he nearly tipped, but he kept going because Martha was in that building. Martha slept in the back of that laundry. Martha was in there. He smelled the smoke before he saw the flames. Thick and acrid with an undertone of something chemical. Something that was not wood or fabric, something heavier. The back porch of the laundry was engulfed, flames reaching up the wall, smoke pouring from the eaves, and the back door, Martha's door, her escape route, was blocked. Someone had wedged wooden crates against it, stacked them tight against the frame so the door could not open outward. Elias did not think. He grabbed the pry bar from his chair mount and attacked the crates, smashing, prying, throwing splintered wood aside with a strength born of terror. He could hear Martha inside, coughing, calling out, alive, but trapped. "Martha!" He shouted her name between blows of the pry bar. "Martha! I am here. Get away from the door. I am breaking through." The crates gave way. The door burst open and Martha stumbled out into the night air, choking on smoke. Her face was black with soot. Her nightdress was singed, and in her right hand she held the Colt Peacemaker. Elias saw the gun and understood something about Martha Hale that he had only guessed at before. When danger came, her first instinct was to reach for a weapon. Not because she was violent, but because she had learned that weapons were the only things that stood between her and the men who would hurt her. She had been sleeping with that gun within reach for years, maybe since before James died. He did not reach for her, did not grab her or hold her. He positioned his chair 2 feet away and said the words that would change everything between them. "You are safe. I am here. I will not touch you unless you want me to." Martha stared at him through the smoke and the tears and the raw shock of nearly dying, and something in her expression shifted. This was the first time a man had asked before reaching for her, the first time someone had given her the choice. She extended her hand, took his, held on tight. The fire brigade arrived minutes later, bucket chains, the hand pump wagon. They saved the main structure, but the back porch was destroyed. The ramp Elias had built was nothing but ash and nails. Sheriff Morrison found the evidence that confirmed what Elias already knew. A broken glass bottle with a kerosene-soaked rag stuffed in the neck. Arson. Deliberate. Tom Birch arrived at the scene and crouched near the remains of the porch. He sniffed the air. "That is not lamp oil," he said to Elias quietly. "That is heavy kerosene, industrial grade, the kind you use for ranch machinery, not something you would buy at a general store." They looked at each other. The implication hung between them unspoken. Who in Red Willow used industrial kerosene? Only the ranches with heavy equipment. Only places like the Pritchard Ranch. After the crowd dispersed, Adelaide rode past on her morning trip to town. She stopped her wagon and looked at the burned laundry, looked at Martha wrapped in a blanket sitting on an upturned washtub, looked at Elias beside her still holding her hand. Adelaide's expression was unreadable. Not satisfaction, not sympathy, just a complicated silence. She said nothing and rode on. That night, after everyone else had gone, Elias sat alone in the alley behind the laundry and stared at the charred remains of the ramp he had built. His first construction in Red Willow. Turned to ash. Someone had used his work as kindling. Someone had tried to burn Martha alive in her own home. And the worst part was not the anger. It was the certainty growing in his gut like frost on glass that this was only the beginning. Adelaide Pritchard had not cried since the day they buried her husband. Not because she was strong, because tears were a luxury that people about to lose everything could not afford. She sat in her ranch office at midnight staring at a stack of bank documents that told a story of slow, inevitable ruin. The numbers did not lie. 60 days to produce $800 or forfeit 1,500 acres of land. Her cattle herd, once 200 strong, was down to 40 after the great die-up. She could not sell enough beef to cover the debt. She could not get a loan without a male co-signer. Wyoming territorial law required a man's signature for any loan above $500, and Adelaide's man was 6 feet under in the Red Willow Cemetery. That was why she had advertised for a husband. Not loneliness, not desire, legal survival. She needed a name on a piece of paper and a body standing beside her in the bank, and she had gotten a man in a wheelchair, and the bank would have laughed them both out of the building. She opened the trunk by her desk and took out Henry's photograph, daguerreotype in a silver frame. Her husband staring out at her with the stern expression that frontier photographers demanded, but that had nothing to do with who he really was. Henry had been gentle, steady, the kind of man who built things that lasted. "I tried, Henry," she said to the photograph. "I tried to find someone who could sign the papers and keep this place alive. The only man who answered was in a wheelchair, and the bank would have laughed us out of the office." She paused. Maybe they would have been right to laugh. Maybe I should let it go. She put the photograph away. She did not let it go. She never would. A noise from outside. Horses in the stable yard at midnight. Adelaide went to the window and saw Carson Briggs standing by the corral talking with a man she did not recognize. A stranger in a city coat. Not a rancher. Not a cowhand. They were examining papers by lantern light, speaking in low voices she could not hear. Adelaide stepped onto the porch. "Carson. Who is that?" Carson's head came up smooth as a cat turning. Just a cattle buyer passing through Mrs. Pritchard. Name of Sullivan. I was trying to get us a better price on the spring sale before the market drops any lower." The stranger tipped his hat and mounted his horse and rode away into the darkness without a word. Carson came to the porch steps and looked up at Adelaide with that respectful, competent expression he always wore. The one that said, "Trust me. I have your best interests at heart." "It is late to be doing business," Adelaide said. "Best deals happen after dark, ma'am, when the competition is sleeping." Adelaide watched him walk back toward the bunkhouse. After he disappeared inside, she stood on the porch in the cold for a long time, staring at the road the stranger had taken, toward Cheyenne. Something was wrong. She could feel it the way you feel a storm coming before you see the clouds, but she could not name it, and she could not afford to lose Carson. He was the only man keeping the ranch operational, the only one who knew where the cattle grazed and when the fences needed mending and which wells were still producing. She went back inside, looked at the books Carson maintained. Income from cattle sales last fall, $600 he had recorded. But Adelaide had only received $350. Carson had explained the discrepancy. Market prices dropped because of the die-up. Everybody took a loss. It made sense, except it did not feel right. Back in Red Willow, the community was rebuilding Martha's laundry porch. Tom Birch organized a work party, 6 men over 4 days. Elias designed the new structure with fire-resistant features and better support. He could not do the heavy lifting, could not climb ladders or work on the roof. But he cut every board, calculated every angle, directed every nail. His limitations did not make him useless. They meant he contributed differently. Martha worked around the construction, washing, wringing, hanging clothes on every available line. She looked exhausted. The fire had shaken her badly, and she was not sleeping. Elias could see it in the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands trembled when she thought nobody was watching. On the 3rd afternoon of construction, Martha stopped working. She set down her basket and stood very still in the middle of the yard with her arms at her sides. "James used to hit me," she said. Elias stopped cutting the board he was measuring. He set down the saw. He did not speak. She told him. Not everything, but enough. The drinking, the fists, the escalation over 3 years from shoves to slaps to closed fist blows that left bruises she hid under long sleeves and high collars. And then the night of the storm. "I locked the bedroom door," she said. He pounded on it, cursed. Then he went quiet. I heard the front door, heard his wagon leave. He was drunk, and it was storming, and the roads were sheets of ice, and I could have opened the door, could have stopped him, could have said, "Do not go out there. You will kill yourself." Her voice was steady, flat, like she was reciting something she had rehearsed 1,000 times. But I did not open the door, because I was more afraid of him than I was of him dying. And in the morning they found his wagon at the bottom of the ravine, and he was dead, and I let it happen. Silence. The wind blew. A hammer rang somewhere on the other side of the building where the work party was still building. "You saved yourself," Elias said finally. "That is not a crime. That is survival." Martha looked at him, and he could see she wanted to believe him. But he could also see something else in her eyes. She was looking at his face and seeing recognition, not of her specific pain, of the flavor of it, the guilt of believing you caused your own catastrophe. She sensed he was carrying something similar, something he had not told her. She almost asked. He almost told her, but he was not ready. And the moment passed like a cloud shadow crossing the ground. Over the next 2 days, Martha pulled away. Not coldly. She was still polite when they crossed paths, still professional when he came to work on the porch. But she stopped inviting him for dinner, stopped lingering after repairs were finished. She was testing him, seeing if he would run now that he knew her worst truth. And she was also punishing herself, pulling back from happiness because she did not believe she had earned it. You should find someone better, she told him outside Nora's shop on the second day, not meeting his eyes. Someone who has not done what I have done. Elias did not argue, did not chase. He said, I will be at Tom's shop if you need anything fixed. And he wheeled away. He left the door open without forcing it. That restraint, that refusal to push, was exactly the thing that would eventually bring her back. That evening alone in her quarters, Martha took the Colt from the drawer and held it for a long time, just feeling the weight of protection, of choice. Then she put it back, and for the first time she did not lock the drawer. She was not sure what that meant yet, but it felt like the beginning of something she could not name. Elias Crow had not been alone, truly alone with no task to complete and no problem to solve. Since the night he lost his legs, he had arranged his entire life to avoid exactly this: silence, stillness, and the sound of his own thoughts. Martha's withdrawal left a gap in his routine that exposed how much she had become his anchor. He worked at Tom's smithy, took repair jobs, fixed a broken well pump for the widow Greer, sharpened tools, repaired harnesses, stayed busy from dawn until well past dark. But the evenings were empty now, and empty evenings were dangerous. Tuesday night, his room at the boarding house. Daniel was out somewhere. Ruth had retired early. The building was quiet in the particular way that old wooden structures got quiet at night. Settling, creaking, the kind of silence that amplified every thought you were trying to avoid. Elias sat at his small table with his flood control plans spread before him, but he could not focus. His eyes kept drifting to the shelf in the hallway just outside his door, where Ruth kept communal supplies for the boarders: coffee, sugar, flour, and a bottle of rye whiskey. He wheeled out of his room, down the narrow hallway, to the shelf. He took the bottle down and brought it back to his table and sat looking at it in the lamplight. It was just a bottle. Brown glass, cork stopper. Nothing special. But what lived inside it was the most dangerous thing in Elias Crow's world. More dangerous than Lloyd Hutchkins. More dangerous than whoever had set fire to Martha's laundry. More dangerous than the guilt he carried about the mine. Because the guilt told him he deserved to be punished, and the whiskey offered to carry out the sentence. He uncorked the bottle. The smell hit him like a physical blow. Sweet, sharp, warm, familiar as his own heartbeat. 3 years of sobriety balanced against one evening of oblivion. He poured a glass. The whiskey caught the lamplight and turned amber gold. He watched it settle, watched the surface go still. He thought about Tunnel 6, about standing at the entrance with this same smell on his breath, about the 2 men who had gotten out because they were sober, and their legs worked, and their reflexes were not dulled by 3 glasses of rye. He thought about his legs, motionless beneath him. Dead weight he carried everywhere like a reminder of his own foolishness. He thought about Martha, who had trusted him with her worst secret, who had shown him the ugliest truth she carried. And he had given her nothing in return. He had sat there and listened, and offered comfort while hiding his own shame behind the same walls she was trying to tear down. He lifted the glass to his lips, stopped. The smell was so close, so present. He could taste it without drinking, could feel the warmth it would bring, the loosening, the quiet, the temporary peace of not having to think about any of it. He tilted the glass, poured the whiskey into the wash basin on the table, watched the amber liquid swirl against the white porcelain and drain away. He recorked the bottle with hands that were shaking so badly the cork barely fit. He wheeled back to the shelf and returned the bottle to its place. The glass clattered against the wood when he set it down. Nobody saw, nobody heard, nobody would ever know about this moment except Elias himself. And that was the point. This was his real victory, not building ramps or fixing wagons or outsmarting Lloyd Hutchkins. Saying no to the thing that had broken him, alone, in the dark, with no audience and no reward. He went back to his room and sat at his table and put his head in his hands and breathed until the shaking stopped. The next morning, he showed Tom the leather glove from the smithy break-in. Tom turned it over in his big scarred hands, studied the stitching. "This is the kind Haskell's saddlery in Cheyenne makes," he said. "Custom work, expensive. Only a few men around here could afford gloves like this." Name them, Tom thought. Willis at the Barrett Ranch north of town. He comes from money. There is a cattle broker named Sullivan who passes through quarterly. And Carson Briggs out at the Pritchard place. Adelaide's foreman, a cattle broker named Sullivan. The same name Carson had used for the stranger Adelaide had seen in her stable yard at midnight. Elias did not know this yet, but the connection was waiting to be made. Other pieces were falling into place. Lloyd's witness, Harlan, had been seen at the Territorial Saloon in Rawlins, the same saloon where Carson Briggs played cards on his days off. The kerosene at Martha's fire smelled industrial. Who used industrial kerosene? Ranches with heavy machinery. Elias did not jump to conclusions. He was an engineer. He gathered data, tested hypotheses, but the evidence was building towards something and he could feel the shape of it forming even if he could not see the whole picture yet. Meanwhile, he continued working on the flood diversion plans. Tom helped him understand the local terrain. Irene Birch provided details about the 1884 flood. Which streets had flooded, where the water had channeled, how deep it had gotten. Elias incorporated every piece of information into his design. The solution was there, elegant and workable. But it required Adelaide's cooperation, and Adelaide was not cooperating. Nora Sedgwick brought him another piece of the puzzle that afternoon. She had compared her shop's transaction records with the dates Lloyd claimed Martha had purchased supplies on credit. On 2 of those 4 dates, Nora had sold supplies to Martha. Paid in cash. Receipted. Martha was not buying from Lloyd on those days because she was buying from Nora instead. The ledger was definitively false, but proving it meant going up against Lloyd again, and Elias was not sure the town was ready for another confrontation. Then Martha came back, not with apologies or explanations. She appeared at Tom's smithy near closing time carrying a basket of clean laundry. Tom and Irene's weekly order. She delivered it, exchanged pleasantries with Tom, then turned to Elias. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for pulling away. You do not owe me anything." "Yes, I do. I told you something true about myself and then I punished you for hearing it. That was not fair." She paused. "Dinner, tonight. I made too much stew again. It was a peace offering dressed up as a practical statement." He accepted it for exactly what it was. Over stew that evening, Martha looked at him across the table with an expression that said she had been building up to something and was finally ready. "I want to know what happened to you," she said. "Not the mine. I know about the mine. I mean, what happened that you have not told anyone?" Elias set down his spoon. He could lie, could deflect, could change the subject the way he had done 100 times, but she had given him her truth in daylight, and he had given her nothing. "Not tonight," he said, "but soon, I promise." Martha studied his face for a long moment. "I will hold you to that," she said, and he knew she would. The Pritchard Ranch looked like a fortress from a distance. Up close, Elias saw it for what it really was, a prison where Adelaide served as both warden and inmate. The decision to ride out to Adelaide's ranch had not come easily. It had taken 3 more days of investigation. Tom matching the dropped glove to Haskell's saddlery records. Nora tracing the drifter Harlan's arrival in Red Willow to the same week Carson Briggs had visited Rawlins for a card game. And Adelaide's own bookkeeper in Cheyenne confirming through a letter Tom sent that the cattle sale prices Carson had reported were significantly lower than actual market rates. Someone was stealing from Adelaide Pritchard, and the evidence pointed to the man she trusted most. Martha drove the wagon because Elias could not. Tom Birch rode alongside on horseback with his rifle in the saddle scabbard. The road to the Pritchard Ranch was 5 miles of frozen ruts and mud. The wagon jolted and swayed, and Elias braced himself against the seat with every lurch. They argued about weapons. "I am bringing the Colt," Martha said flatly. "We are going to talk to her, not fight. If we need a conversation and do not have guns, we are dead." Martha. If we need guns to have a conversation, we have already lost. She looked at him sideways. And if Carson is there, and he does not feel like talking? Elias did not have an answer for that. The colt rode under the wagon seat. Martha won. Before they reached the ranch, Elias asked her to stop the wagon. There was something he needed to say, something he had promised to tell her. And if things went badly at the ranch, he did not want this secret standing between them. Martha pulled the horses up. The wagon creaked to a stop. Wind blew across the open range, carrying the smell of snow and sage. The night the mine collapsed, Elias began, then stopped, started again. I had been drinking 3 glasses of whiskey before the night shift, with the boys, the way we always did. Martha was quiet, watching him. My reflexes were slow. When the support beam cracked, the other men reacted in time, got clear. I was 2 seconds behind them. 2 seconds. That is all it takes when the ceiling is coming down. He looked at his legs, motionless beneath the blanket Martha had tucked over them against the cold. If I had been sober, I would have cleared the tunnel. These legs, I took them from myself. The wind blew. A hawk circled overhead, circled. In the distance, the Pritchard Ranch buildings were visible against the snow. Martha spoke carefully. You drank 3 glasses of whiskey 3 years ago. You have not touched a drop since. No, that does not make you a criminal, Elias. That makes you a man who changed. But she was not finished. And if you are telling me now because you think it makes you unworthy of what is happening between us, stop. I have already decided you are worth the risk. The question is whether you will decide the same thing about yourself. Elias looked at her. At this woman who had survived a violent marriage and 3 years of guilt in a town that wanted to grind her down, and who still somehow had enough room in her heart to see him clearly. I am working on it, he said. Work faster, she said, and snapped the reins. They reached the ranch gate at mid-morning. Carson Briggs stood there like he had been expecting them. His hand rested near the holster on his hip, not drawing, just reminding everyone it was there. Mrs. Pritchard is not receiving visitors. Tom Birch nudged his horse forward. She will see us, or we will have a conversation with the territorial marshal about falsified cattle records and industrial kerosene. Something crossed Carson's face, quick as lightning. Fear. Then it was gone, replaced by the blank, competent mask he always wore. But Elias had seen it, and he knew. Adelaide appeared on the porch. She was wearing a man's coat over her dress, and her expression was granite. What is this about? Ma'am Elias said. We need to speak with you privately. It concerns your ranch, your finances, and your foreman. In Adelaide's parlor, Elias laid out what they had gathered. He did it the way he would present an engineering diagram. Systematic, factual, without emotion. Lloyd Hutchkins falsified a ledger against Martha Hale, claiming debts that never existed. His witness was a drifter named Harlan, who was paid to lie. Harlan can be connected to card games in Rawlins, the same games your foreman Carson Briggs attends regularly. Adelaide's face was stone. Go on. Martha's laundry was set on fire using industrial kerosene. Not the kind you buy at a general store. The kind ranches use for heavy equipment. A glove was dropped at the scene of a break-in at Tom's smithy. Custom leather from Haskell's saddlery in Cheyenne. The same saddlery that makes Carson Briggs's riding gear. He paused. Let the pieces settle. And your cattle sale records show $600 in revenue last fall. But the actual market price for the number of head you sold should have been closer to $900. The difference went somewhere, Mrs. Pritchard, and it was not into your bank account. The realization moved across Adelaide's face like weather. Shock, then denial, then fury, then grief, all in the space of 10 seconds. She looked at the papers Elias had brought, at the figures that told a story she did not want to believe. Carson, she said. The name came out barely above a whisper. We believe he has been embezzling from the ranch for at least 2 years, steering you toward bankruptcy so the property could be purchased cheaply by someone connected to him. The cattle buyer who visited your ranch at night, the one Carson called Sullivan. We believe he is Carson's cousin from Cheyenne." Adelaide stood very still. Then she walked to her husband's gun cabinet, opened it, took out the Sharps rifle Henry had used for buffalo hunting. Her hands were steady. "This ranch is mine," she said. "If Carson wants it, he will have to take it from my dead body." Carson had been listening from the hallway. They heard the back door slam, boots running, the stable door banging open. When Tom looked out the window, 2 horses were galloping north toward the mountain road. Carson was riding hard, and he was not coming back to talk. "He is running," Tom said. Martha shook her head. "He is not running. He has no money, no plan without this ranch. He will be back, and when he comes back, he will not be talking." Adelaide looked at Elias, then at Martha, then at Tom. 4 people in a parlor with winter pressing against the windows and a man with a Winchester riding toward trouble. "How many men does Carson know who would ride with him for money?" Elias asked. Adelaide thought for a long moment. "At least 2, she said. "Maybe 3. And they will not be the kind who talk first." In the war, men said time slowed down when the bullets flew. Elias did not know if that was true. He only knew that when Carson Briggs stepped out of the darkness with a Winchester leveled at his chest, each second stretched long enough to hold an entire lifetime of regret. Night fell on the Pritchard ranch like a curtain dropping. They had sent Daniel on horseback to town to alert the sheriff. The boy had insisted on coming back, and Tom had finally let him because arguing with Daniel Farrow was like arguing with a fence post. It heard you. It did not care. 5 of them now. Elias, Martha, Tom, Adelaide, and Daniel. Against at least 3 armed men who were coming in the dark. Elias could not ride, could not patrol, could not take a position on the roof or in the barn loft like a man with working legs would. But he could think. And thinking was what he did best. He rigged an early warning system around the ranch perimeter using rope and tin cans and baling wire. A tripwire grid spanning the 3 most likely approaches. West from the mountain road, north through the tree line, east along the creek bed. Any man tripping a wire would send a cascade of rattling tin into the night air and give them 30 seconds of warning. Adelaide watched him work and said nothing, but something in her expression had changed since the parlor. She was looking at his hands, at the speed and precision with which he improvised solutions from whatever materials he could find. She was seeing what she should have seen at the train station 2 months ago. Tom positioned himself on the front porch with his rifle. Adelaide took the back of the house with the Sharps. Daniel stood watch by the stable. Martha stayed inside with Elias near the ranch's hydraulic pump system. She had the Colt in her hand, and her eyes were steady. "You do not have to do this, Martha," Elias said. "This is not your fight." "Someone tried to burn me alive in my own home," she said. "That makes it my fight." The wind picked up after midnight. Snowmelt fog rolled across the valley floor, cutting visibility to 30 yards. Temperature dropping. The world reduced to shapes and shadows and the sound of wind in the cottonwoods. The tin cans rattled at 2:14 in the morning. West side, the mountain road approach. 3 shapes moving through the fog. Fast. Tom fired from the porch. A warning shot that cracked the night air and sent sparks off the stone water trough. The answer came immediately. A Winchester round that splintered the porch railing 6 inches from Tom's head. Real ammunition. Real intent. Tom dropped behind the railing and returned fire. Adelaide opened up from the back window with the Sharps. The big rifle boomed like thunder, and somewhere in the dark a man yelped and the sound of running feet scattered in 2 directions. Daniel did the bravest, stupidest thing of the night. He ran from the stable toward the corral to move the horses before anyone could set the building alight. He was 19 years old and fast as a deer, and he made it halfway across the yard before one of the hired guns spotted his silhouette and fired. The bullet caught Daniel in the shoulder. He spun and fell in the mud and tried to crawl and could not. Blood on the snow, black in the moonlight. Daniel screaming, not from fear, from pain. The real ugly sound of a body that had been torn by lead. Tom was pinned on the porch. Adelaide was covering the back. Nobody could get to Daniel. Inside the ranch house, Elias heard the shot, heard Daniel fall, heard the screaming. and could do nothing. The ranch yard was a lake of mud and uneven ground. His wheelchair would be useless in seconds. He could not get out there, could not fight on their terms, could not run or dodge or take cover behind a horse trough, or do any of the 100 things that men with working legs did in situations like this. He slammed his fist against the wheel rim hard enough to split the skin on his knuckles. The old voice roared in his head. "You are useless. You are broken. You deserve this." Martha grabbed his hand. Her grip was iron. "Stop it," she said. "Do not try to be who you are not. Be who you are. Think. What can you do that nobody else here can?" Elias looked around the room. His eyes swept past the kitchen, past the parlor, past the staircase. They landed on the ranch's hydraulic pump system, the one that drew water from the deep well to fill the cattle troughs in the yard. A machine. His territory. "Help me get to the pump room," he said. Martha pushed his chair through the house to the utility room where the pump machinery was housed. Big iron contraption. Pipes running out through the walls to the yard troughs. A pressure system Elias understood instantly because he had built similar systems in the Colorado mines. He rerouted the output, disconnected the trough feeds, connected the main line to the yard's central standpipe, sealed the overflow valves with rags and wire. Then he began cranking the pressure lever, building pressure, more. The pipes groaned and the pump machinery shuddered, and Martha held the connections tight where he told her to hold them. Outside, Carson was shouting for his men to advance. "Move in! They are pinned down! Take the house!" Elias heard boots in the yard, close, getting closer. "Now," he said, "open the valve." Martha turned the main valve. 35-degree well water hit the standpipe at maximum pressure and erupted into the ranch yard in a blast that knocked Carson and both his hired men off their feet. The stream was powerful enough to stagger a horse, and the water was cold enough to stop a man's breath. In 20-degree air, the effect was devastating. 3 men went down in the mud, gasping and choking and clawing at their faces. Rifles dropped, bodies curled against the cold. Tom was off the porch in seconds. He reached Daniel first, dragged the boy behind the water trough, then turned and covered the yard while the hired men stumbled and fell and stumbled again. They were done. Hypothermia was already setting in, and they had lost their weapons and their will to fight. But Carson was tougher than the men he had hired. He staggered upright, soaked to the skin and shaking with cold but still holding his Winchester. He charged the front door of the ranch house, kicking it open with a boot that sprayed water across the hallway floor. Martha met him there. She stood in the hallway with the Colt peacemaker leveled at his chest. Water dripped from the ceiling where the pipes had leaked. The lamplight caught the barrel of her gun and the absolute stillness of her hands. "One more step," she said. Carson laughed. The sound of a man who had gambled everything and lost and did not care anymore. "You will not shoot." Martha shot him. Once. In the leg. Below the knee. Not a lucky shot. A precise, deliberate shot from a woman who had practiced every Sunday for 3 years because she had sworn that no man would ever put his hands on her again without her permission. Carson fell. The Winchester clattered away across the floor. He screamed and grabbed his leg, and the blood pooled dark and fast on Adelaide's clean hallway floor. Adelaide came down the stairs with the Sharps. She looked at Carson writhing on her floor, at Martha standing over him with smoke still curling from the Colt, at Elias in the doorway of the pump room. "Someone tie this man up," she said. "He is bleeding on my good carpet." Sheriff Morrison arrived an hour later, summoned by Ruth Sedgwick, who had heard the distant gunfire from town and sent a rider. He found 3 men in custody, a wounded foreman, a shot-up porch, and 5 people who had survived a siege with a water pump and a Colt peacemaker. Dr. Whitfield worked on Daniel at the kitchen table. The bullet had passed through the shoulder muscle, missed the bone but tore the rotator cuff badly. Daniel would live, but he would never have full use of that arm again. Elias sat beside the boy and watched the doctor work and saw his own story beginning again in someone else. A young man, strong and fast and reckless, cut down in a moment, left with a body that would never work the way it used to. Someone handed Elias a glass of whiskey. For the nerves, they said. Good for the shock. He took the glass, held it. Martha watched from across the kitchen. She watched his hand shake, watched him stare at the amber liquid, watched the war play out across his face. He set the glass down untouched. Martha crossed the kitchen, took the glass away, poured him coffee instead. No questions, no drama, no speeches about strength or willpower, just understanding. As dawn broke over the Pritchard ranch, Adelaide stood beside Elias on the porch. Her face was drawn, but her eyes were sharp. "You saved my ranch," she said, "with a water pump." Elias looked at the blood on the porch boards, at Daniel unconscious on the kitchen table inside, at Martha sitting on the steps with the Colt still in her lap staring at the spot where Carson had fallen. "I did not save anything," he said. "I just opened a valve. Everyone else did the fighting." He looked at Martha, at the woman who had shot a man to protect them all, and who would carry that weight alongside every other weight she already bore, especially her. Spring came to Red Willow not with fanfare, but the way Martha laughed. Slow, unexpected. And once you noticed it was there, you could not remember a time when it was not. 6 weeks had passed since the night at the Pritchard Ranch, and the town that had been slowly dying all winter was beginning to show signs of something that might have been life. Not a resurrection, exactly. More like a stubborn refusal to give up, which when you thought about it was just about the most Western thing there was. Carson Briggs stood trial at the territorial court in Cheyenne. The charges read like a catalog of sins: arson, 2 counts, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder, fraud, embezzlement. The territorial judge was a hard man from Virginia who had no patience for frontier outlaws dressed in foreman's clothing. He sentenced Carson to 25 years at the Wyoming Territorial Prison in Laramie, the stone-walled institution on the banks of the Big Laramie River where the territory sent the men it wanted to forget. Carson's cousin, the man called Sullivan, was charged separately with conspiracy to defraud and was awaiting trial in the Laramie County Jail. Lloyd Hutchkins had a choice to make, and for once in his miserable life he made the right one. He testified against Carson, told the court about the gambling debts, the coercion, the false ledger entries he had been forced to make against Martha. The judge took his cooperation into account but was not feeling generous. Lloyd was barred from operating a business within the territory of Wyoming for 5 years and placed under territorial supervision. He left Red Willow on a Tuesday morning with his wife and a single wagon load of possessions. Nobody came to see him off. Adelaide Pritchard sold 400 acres of eastern pasture to the bank to clear her debt. She kept 1,100, smaller but manageable. She hired 2 new hands from the employment office in Cheyenne, men she interviewed herself, whose references she checked personally, whose books she would keep with her own hand because she had learned the hard way what happened when you let someone else hold the pen. She rode into town on a warm April morning and tied her horse outside Tom's smithy. Tom was working the forge. Elias was at his bench repairing a complicated gear assembly. "Mr. Crow," Adelaide said, "may I speak with you?" They went outside. Adelaide stood very straight. Her hands were clasped in front of her. She was struggling with the words, and it showed. "I am offering you a position at the ranch," she said. "Machinery maintenance, equipment repair, irrigation work, twice what Tom pays you, housing if you want it." Elias considered it. Good money, steady work, more than he had imagined earning in a frontier town. "I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Pritchard, but I am happy where I am. I have work with Tom. I have side jobs around town, and I have started to build a life here in Red Willow proper. Because of Martha Hale. Partly, but also because I have learned something about myself these past months. I do not need the biggest job or the most money. I need to be somewhere I can do good work for people I respect. I found that here." Adelaide nodded slowly. "Then let me propose a seasonal contract instead. You come out to the ranch 4 times a year. Maintain the machinery. Inspect the irrigation system. I will pay you $20 per visit. That I can do." They shook on it. And as Adelaide turned to go, she paused. I should never have turned you away at that station. I looked at your chair and saw weakness. I should have looked at your hands. What is done, yes. But some things need saying even when they are late. She mounted her horse and rode out of town. Not healed, not transformed, but honest. And that was enough. Daniel Farrow's shoulder healed, but the arm was weak and would stay weak. He went through a period of anger and withdrawal that reminded Elias painfully of his own first months after the mine. The boy who had been all motion and reckless energy was suddenly still and quiet and frightened. Elias did not give him a speech, did not offer wisdom or philosophy. He set a drafting kit on the table in front of Daniel. Pencils, straight edge, compass, clean paper. Your left hand still works, he said. I will teach you mechanical drawing. $5 a week. Daniel stared at the kit for a long time. Then he picked up a pencil with his left hand. The line he drew was crooked, unsteady. The line of a man learning to use a hand he had never relied on before. It was a start. The spring thaw came hard and fast in late March, exactly as Elias had predicted. The creek swelled, water rose. Water. But Elias's flood diversion system was in place. He had spent 2 weeks overseeing construction. 20 men from town digging channels and building berms and laying pipe according to his designs. Adelaide had granted access to her upstream land without hesitation. The work was hard and muddy and unglamorous, and when the floodwaters came, they hit the diversion channel and rolled into the new reservoir exactly as the blueprints said they would. Red Willow did not flood. The town's water supply held. Adelaide's irrigation infrastructure survived intact. Nobody threw a parade. Nobody made speeches. They just did not drown. And in a town that had spent the winter wondering if it would survive to see summer, that was more than enough. Tom Birch put up a new sign outside the smithy. Birch and Crow. Smithing and mechanical repair. The letters were hand-painted by Irene, who had better penmanship than either of them. Ruth Sedgwick added a ground-floor room to the boarding house. Wide doorways, no thresholds, smooth floors, based on Elias's specifications. She did not call it a charity project, she called it good business sense. More potential customers, she said. About time someone in this town thought ahead. Nora took over the dry goods shop full-time and started keeping the kind of meticulous records that would make Lloyd Hutchkins' ghost weep with envy. The workshop Elias had designed was built onto the back of Martha's laundry property. 2 buildings sharing one wall, connected by a door that swung both ways. His workspace, hers, joined at the foundation. It was not a metaphor. Or maybe it was. Either way it worked. On a warm evening in late May, Elias sat on Martha's back porch. The porch he had built twice now, once before the fire, once after. He had a small object in his hand, an iron ring. He had forged it himself at Tom's smithy, not gold, because gold was soft, and what they had was not. Inside the band he had engraved the date they met. February 14th, 1887. The day he had arrived in Red Willow and lost everything he thought he wanted, and found everything he actually needed. Martha came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him. The evening light was golden, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were fully leafed out in pale green. Somewhere in town a piano was playing, the sound of a place that was deciding to live. I built this ramp the first day I met you, Elias said. He looked at the boards beneath his wheels. Smooth and solid and built to last. I remember Martha said, you charged me $2. It was the best $2 I ever earned, because it brought me to you. Martha looked at him, waiting. This ramp was the first thing I built in Red Willow, he said. You are the reason I wanted to build everything after. He held out the ring. Martha took it, turned it in her fingers, felt the weight of it, felt the date inscribed inside. I need you to know something, she said, and her voice was steady and clear. I do not need anyone to save me. I need someone beside me. You did not save me either, Elias said. You just showed me I was worth saving. Turns out that was the harder thing. She put the ring on. It fit. They were married in June under the cottonwood trees by the creek. Tom and Irene stood as witnesses. Ruth provided the venue, her backyard, cleaned up and strung with lanterns that Irene had insisted on. Daniel sketched the ceremony with his left hand. The lines were shaky and imperfect and beautiful. Adelaide Pritchard attended. She sat in the back, said little, but she was present. And presence was its own kind of reconciliation. After the ceremony, as people milled about with plates of food and cups of punch, Adelaide approached Elias. She was carrying something, a folded letter, yellowed and worn from handling. "Your first letter," she said, "the one where you mentioned the wheelchair in the opening line." Elias stared. "How do you—" "I sent 3 drafts. You sent all 3. The Red Willow post office has 1 clerk, and he delivered every letter you mailed to my address." Adelaide's expression was complicated. Regret and honesty, and something that might have been admiration. "I read the first letter. The one that started with, 'I am a man who uses a wheelchair, but I wanted you to know that before you knew anything else about me. I thought it was weakness. I wrote back anyway because I was desperate." She paused. "I have read that line 100 times since. I understand now. It was not weakness. It was the bravest thing in any of those 3 letters." She looked at Martha. "You found a better match than I deserved to make." And she walked away, not healed, not transformed, but honest, which in the end was all anyone could offer. Elias stood there holding the old letter and feeling the weight of it. The weight of a younger version of himself who had been brave enough to tell the truth before he learned to hide it. Maybe that younger man had known something the older one had forgotten. That honesty was not the same as weakness. That showing your scars was not the same as surrendering. Martha appeared at his side, took his hand, read the letter over his shoulder. "You should have sent that one," she said. "I know." She kissed him. And somewhere in the crowd, Daniel whistled with his good hand cupped around his mouth, and Tom laughed, and Irene told them both to hush, and Ruth Sedgwick smiled, which according to Daniel was a miracle worth the price of the whole wedding. On a morning in early summer, Martha stood at the kitchen window of the house that sat between the laundry and the workshop. Their house. The one they had built together from lumber and nails, and the stubborn refusal to accept that broken meant finished. She watched Elias wheel across the yard toward his workshop, sunlight warm on his shoulders, and she heard something she had never heard from him before. He was whistling. A tune she did not recognize. Something made up on the spot. The tuneless, happy sound of a man who had stopped rehearsing his own defeat. She turned back to the room. On the workbench by the window, she noticed a sheet of drafting paper. Old, creased from folding. She recognized it. The paper he had drawn on his first night in Red Willow. A wheelchair redesign covered in precise measurements and engineering notes. But in the corner in small handwriting, a line had been written and then crossed out. Not erased, just struck through, as if he had changed his mind. "If nobody needs me here, move on." Martha ran her thumb over the crossed-out words, feeling the grooves the pencil had pressed into the paper, feeling the weight of what those words had meant on a cold February night when a man in a wheelchair sat alone in a tiny room in a town that had already rejected him and wrote his own exit plan. She turned the paper over. On the back, in newer pencil, darker, more confident, Elias had drawn a floor plan, the workshop connected to the laundry, their house between them. And in the right corner, in his careful engineer's handwriting, 2 words followed by a question mark. Children's room. Martha folded the paper, put it in her apron pocket. She rested one hand on her stomach, a gesture so brief and quiet that only someone watching closely would have noticed. She picked up 2 cups of coffee, walked out into the morning light, toward the sound of whistling, toward the man the world had called broken, but she called husband. She set his coffee on the workbench, let her hand rest on his shoulder as she passed. He looked up with the smile of a man who had stopped writing "Move On." A man who had found after 3 years of wheels and work and stubborn refusal to be less than whole the place where the wind stopped, and called it home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.